Dan Hurley is staying with the UConn Huskies. What does that mean for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Tuesday. Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Folks, these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Well, Danny Hurley is staying at UConn, shooting for a quest to get a three-peat, first time since John Wooden in the 1970s. Dan Hurley's return to college basketball is great news for the sport. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about Gonzaga's other non-conference opponents, give you an update on where UCLA is at, Washington, San Diego State, Kentucky, etc. And then we're going to close out the show talking about those 5 games that have yet to be scheduled, who Gonzaga might play, if there's any marquee opponents still to be added to Gonzaga's non-conference schedule ahead of the upcoming season. But we start in Storrs, Connecticut. Dan Hurley, forever now, can introduce himself as not only a back-to-back national championship winner, but a coach who rejected both the Kentucky Wildcats and the Los Angeles Lakers in the same offseason. Not a whole lot of people with that on their resume. A tremendous flex for Dan Hurley to be able to do this. Reportedly, he was offered a deal somewhere in the ballpark of 6 years and $70 million from the Los Angeles Lakers. He met with the Lakers front office. He flew out to LA. Him and his wife were there. They talked to the front office. They talked to the people in the Lakers, kind of heard their vision, their plan, what they had in mind for Dan Hurley to come over and take over that franchise after back-to-back 2 or 3 consecutive years of struggling for the Lakers after that. They're the bubble championship that they won under Frank Vogel a few years ago. Haven't been very good since then. So looking for a new face after firing Darvin Ham. They go after Hurley. Hurley decides to stay. And he goes to a Billy Joel concert over the weekend at Madison Square Garden. Everybody was kind of, what does this mean? Is this a last hurrah? Is he actually staying? What's the situation here? He pushes back UConn's practice on Monday for a couple of hours. Everybody was kind of feeling like it was really getting dragged out. But ultimately, the 51-year-old head coach decides to return to Storrs, get that opportunity to go after a three-peat. The UConn is working on an extension with Dan Hurley. They've been working on trying to get an extension for him since they won the first championship last year. So it's been a long process. The latest indications are that the governor of Connecticut, who is now getting involved in this situation, is working to try to make sure that Dan Hurley is the highest paid coach in college basketball. The other reports indicate that this 6-year, $50 million offer, which is what UConn had been previously offering, would make him one of the most highest paid coaches in college basketball, but not quite at the top of that scale. So still waiting to see what that final what that final contract extension is going to look like for Hurley. But this is great news for the sport. There's really just not any other way to say it. He's a big personality. He's an excellent X's and O's coach. And he's put a program in UConn squarely on the map. Not like they weren't before. They had 4 championships before Danny Hurley was their head coach. I'm not trying to imply that UConn wasn't a premier brand in the sport, but the fact that Dan Hurley turned down an opportunity to coach in the NBA, not just to return to an SEC school or a Big Ten school. It would still be great for college basketball if a coach turned down the Lakers to stay at Alabama or Michigan State or wherever. But to do it at a Big East school when there's so much consternation and panic about every program that's not in the SEC, Big Ten, and Big 12. If you're not in those conferences, there is some slight uneasiness to full-blown panic that you're feeling right now. We watched the Pac-12 dissolve. We're sort of watching it happen to the ACC. It hasn't quite started yet, but it feels like they're one little push away from everything crumbling underneath them the way that it happened to the Pac-12. The Big East is concerned. I don't think the Big East is going to disband or dissolve, but I think there's a possibility that changes happen. And frankly, UConn could be involved. UConn could get an invite to the Big 12 now that Dan Hurley has signed this, once he signs this extension, I should say. That's speculation on my part. That there's just been rumors about that. There's nothing concrete or certain in any capacity in that regard. But if the ACC falls apart, if the Big East starts trying to pull some of those schools back in, like Syracuse or Louisville or somebody like that, and the Big 12 says, well, if the Big East is trying to do that, we're going to take their big piece in UConn. All these things could end up happening. So there's still some dominoes that could be falling here. But ultimately, Dan Hurley is the kind of personality that college basketball wants to keep as much as they can. He's loud. He's a little bit obnoxious. He's arrogant, confident. He yells at referees. I know some people don't like those things, but I think college basketball needs those kind of personalities. It doesn't work in the NBA. That's the other part of this thing. If Dan Hurley tried to be the bigger personality on the Lakers when you have LeBron James and Anthony Davis, it's just not going to work. It's not going to work. And so I think that it was a good decision for him to come back, just in terms of being able to keep his reputation and continue to build something potentially, all-time great level at UConn if they can continue to win. And I'm very curious if UConn is able to contend seriously for a three-peat. And we'll get a good look at them, because Gonzaga is going to play UConn on December 14th at the Madison Square Garden, mecca for basketball. It's going to be a phenomenal game. It's the return game, of course, of the 2-year home and home in quotation marks series between Gonzaga and UConn. Last year they played in Seattle at Climate Pledge Arena. UConn won that game by 13. It was a little bit closer than the score indicated, but Gonzaga just really couldn't get a whole lot going offensively in that game. Donovan Clingan played well, and Cam Spencer hit some big shots in the first half, and that kind of was enough for Gonzaga to really struggle to stay in that contest, unfortunately. But now they get this opportunity here at Madison Square Garden. Gonzaga's got mostly the same pieces together. UConn does not. And if they had lost Dan Hurley, I think it would have been a complete disaster. Every single player on that roster could have entered the transfer portal if Dan Hurley had left for a new job. I think a lot of them would have. As it stands right now, that roster is pretty much intact. They lost 4 of 5 starters. Donovan Clingan and Stephon Castle are going to be 2 of the top 15 players picked in the NBA draft, probably top 10, if we're being honest. Tristan Newton and Cam Spencer are both out of eligibility, but they are both likely, or at least possible, NBA players, 2-way contract G League guys. So they lost 4 of their 5 starters. The only one who returns is Alex Karaban, who frankly would have been a higher draft pick than both Spencer or Newton had he stayed in the draft process, but he opted to return to school. They bring some guys who were role players in the past are going to step into bigger roles. Samson Johnson will probably replace Donovan Clingan in the front court. Hassan Diarra is going to probably step into that starting point guard role. Solomon Ball, Jalen Stewart, a Seattle product. Those guys will step into bigger roles. They also add key pieces in the transfer portal, including very well-known to Gonzaga fans, point guard Aidan Mahaney, coming over from St. Mary's. I'm incredibly intrigued and a little bit cautious in my belief in how Aidan Mahaney is going to do in that system. I think Dan Hurley and Luke Murray, their assistant coach, are phenomenal. X's and O's coaches, phenomenal basketball coaches, particularly offensively in Murray's case. And I think they're going to find a way to unlock Mahaney a little bit and bring him out of a system that was very slow and plotting and methodical. We all know what St. Mary's system looks like. And I think it could really help unlock him. And I think it's going to be a good litmus test for this coaching staff. If Mahaney thrives in that system after coming from a completely different system, that says a lot about this staff's ability to develop players in a short period of time and identify talent that they think can work in their system. So, and if it doesn't work, then, we can start to question, were they just really lucky with Cam Spencer? Were they really lucky with Tristan Newton? Probably not. I think you'd need to see multiple failures to start to really question the staff. But Mahaney, to me, is going to be an interesting kind of litmus test for that staff going forward. I'm very excited about this game. We're going to talk about the rest of Gonzaga's non-conference schedule, the Kentucky, San Diego State, Washington, et cetera, that they have going forward this season. But this game against UConn, back-to-back national champions. It's a matchup against Aidan Mahaney, who's been a thorn in Gonzaga's side for the last couple of years. It's a matchup against Alex Karaban, who's now beat Gonzaga a handful of times the last couple of years as well. It's played at the best basketball arena in the country. They also have Liam McNeeley, an incoming freshman, top 10 player in the 2024 recruiting class, a player that Gonzaga was connected to prior to him committing to Indiana. He decommitted to Indiana. Gonzaga was once again back in the mix, and then he committed to UConn. So another player that has some ties to Gonzaga as well. So there's a lot going on here. I think the last point I'll make is Dan Hurley and Mark Few are not the same. Obviously, Mark Few's been at the same place for a lot longer. He's had more sustained success. He has not won national championships. He also has not publicly rejected an NBA job. But Mark Few has stayed where he has. And that the fact that Mark Few has stayed and built a program rather than taking opportunities to go other places, which we know were offered to him earlier in his career, has made college basketball better. Dan Hurley choosing to stay at UConn makes college basketball better. Again, the rest of the comparisons is not really there right now, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there are coaches who are not jumping at the first opportunity, who are staying in college basketball and building something at the school that they're at. And I think that, among many other things, is one of the things that makes college basketball truly great. And so that's why I'm happy to see Dan Hurley back, even if it makes Gonzaga's odds of winning that game in December probably a little bit harder than they would have been had he departed. Well, UConn is one of Gonzaga's known non-conference opponents for this upcoming season. We're going to discuss the other ones. We're going to talk about Kentucky's new roster. We're going to talk about what's going on at Washington and San Diego State. All that coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you all about today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. Folks, when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster, and they do it for free. And LinkedIn is not just another generic job board. They help you hire professionals that you cannot find anywhere else, even those who are not actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. And in a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users do not visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is also constantly finding ways to make this process even easier, including launching a feature that helps you write your own job descriptions. Much, much quicker process. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockdowncollege. It's linkedin.com/lockdowncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, folks, segment 2, still Eddie Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we are going to look at the games we know on Gonzaga's non-conference schedule. That's what we're talking about in this segment. The final segment of the show is talking about the games we don't know, making some predictions, some projections, how we think the rest of Gonzaga's schedule might shake out this upcoming season. But here we're going to talk about what we do know about Gonzaga's schedule. Obviously, UConn on December 14th at the Madison Square Garden. We have discussed that already. An incredibly exciting game, a great opportunity for Gonzaga to get their brand out in the New York market. Obviously, a fantastic opponent. Should be an incredible basketball game. 1 week before that, Gonzaga will play at Climate Pledge Arena, just like they did last year against UConn, but this time they will take on the Wildcats of Kentucky. December 7th, Climate Pledge Arena, Gonzaga, Kentucky. That is the date. It's gonna be a blast. Part of a 6-year series that was initially agreed to by Mark Few and John Calipari. This will be the third game in that series. Gonzaga won the first game at the Spokane Arena. They won the second game at Rupp Arena in Kentucky in Lexington. Now they get a chance for game number 3 at the Climate Pledge Arena, but they're not playing John Calipari. And in fact, they're not playing a single player who was on Kentucky's roster last year. Not one of them is back. Crazy coaching carousel this offseason. SMU fires their coach. Andy Enfield from USC decides to leave for USC and go to SMU. Eric Musselman in Arkansas decides to take the job at USC. John Calipari decides to take the job at Arkansas. Mark Pope from BYU decides to go to Lexington and take the job at Kentucky. BYU ends up hiring Kevin Young from the Phoenix Suns in what was a very unique, very wild coaching carousel earlier this offseason. Mark Pope is a former Kentucky Wildcat. He won a national championship under Coach Rick Pitino in 1996. He had an NBA career. He was a prolific coach at Utah Valley, was good the last 5 years or so at BYU. I know a lot of Gonzaga fans laughed and laughed and laughed when he took the Kentucky job. Thought this team finished 5th in the WCC 2 years ago. Mark Pope's a really good coach. This is a really good hire for Kentucky. I'm adamant about that. And I think that the jokes about BYU not being good their final year in the WCC, sure, it's true. That was the reality of the situation. They had an off year, and Mark Pope hasn't had a lot of NCAA tournament success, but I think this is really going to work. Maybe not in year 1, but I think that this is going to work for Kentucky. And that's what's going to be interesting. December 7th is about a month into the season. I haven't looked at Kentucky's full schedule. It's not finalized yet. Almost no team, if any team's non-conference schedule is fully finalized at this point. But this will be one of their first 6 or 7 games, most likely, will be against Gonzaga. I don't know how many other big games they'll have had, but this is a pseudo road game for Kentucky. And it is like I said, a completely new roster. This is my prediction, my best guess at their lineup, as Mark Pope has been very aggressive filling out this roster via the transfer portal. Andrew Carr and Brandon Garrison are your 2 front court starters. Andrew Carr is a transfer from Wake Forest. Brandon Garrison comes over from Oklahoma State. Jackson Robinson was the only player from BYU to follow Mark Pope to Lexington. He pulled out of the NBA draft process, high-level scorer, veteran guard. He's going to be the 3 for this team. Kobe Brea is one of the most prolific three-point shooters in the entire country last year, shot about 50% from 3 on a high volume. He comes over from Dayton. And then Kirk Kriisa, that's a familiar face for Gonzaga fans, former Arizona Wildcat. Starting point guard was at West Virginia last year. He is going to be the starting point guard for this Mark Pope-led Kentucky team. They also have Lamont Butler, he who hit that big shot against Florida Atlantic in the NCAA tournament 2 years ago from San Diego State. He's coming off the bench for this Kentucky team. Otega Owe is a big-time transfer from Oklahoma. Amari Williams is their big man coming over from Drexel. They got a trio of freshmen coming in, including Colin Chandler, who is a highly regarded freshman in the BYU recruiting class, who has flipped to come to Kentucky. So lots of excitement for Mark Pope's team. Lots of intrigue. I don't know how good they're going to be. I truly don't. It kind of depends how all the pieces fit. I think Mark Pope went out and got guys who fit his system, and I think that's going to help them be successful. But it might take a while. The odds of them being good in March, I think, are fairly high. The odds of them being good in early December, fairly low. So I think Gonzaga's got a pretty big-time advantage here. I think of all the games that they've played, this is the one that Gonzaga, quote-unquote, should win, more so than the other ones. Last year, they should not have won at Rupp Arena, but they did, and that was kind of turned their season around. The year prior to that, obviously, was at the Arena that Gonzaga had an advantage there, but that Kentucky team was really good, and it was kind of not necessarily expected that Gonzaga wins that one. So this is the one that they're more likely to be expected to win. They're more likely to be favored in this contest, but I think it's going to be a really good opportunity for Gonzaga to pick up a win against a team that's probably going to move up 10, 15, 20 spots in the net ranking from where they are when Gonzaga plays them in December to where they are in March. So I think this is a great opportunity for Gonzaga. A couple other non-con games that we know about. UCLA, this game will be played at the Intuit Dome in LA or in Inglewood area. It's the new home for the Los Angeles Clippers. It's part of a 2-year series agreed to between Mark Few and Mick Cronin. The return game will be at Climate Pledge Arena next season. So we'll see. We'll get a chance to see UCLA for at least 2 more years. This is a team that really struggled last year. We saw them in the Maui Invitational. They did not look very good in that game. Granted, neither did Gonzaga. Both teams were playing their 3rd game in 3 days, but UCLA just never really found it last year. They had a lot of international prospects who came in, a lot of international freshmen who just never really stepped into the roles that Mick Cronin identified for them. Some of their younger guards, Sebastian Mack and others, just really struggled, and Mick Cronin was whining to the media. He was complaining about not having enough money. He was complaining about the players on his team, which he picked. It was a really weird year for Mick Cronin and UCLA last year, but they seemed to have rebuilt nicely this offseason. They lost a lot of those international players. I don't really blame them. Berke Bayak-Tunsel, who was a potential one-and-done candidate when he committed to UCLA out of Turkey. He's now transferred to Nebraska. Elaine Fiblio is still in the transfer portal. He was a Gonzaga target out of France. Jan Vide was another Gonzaga target who was at UCLA. He is transferred to LMU, and I think could be a really big-time player for them. They also lose Will McClendon to San Jose State, and they lose Adem Bona, their starting center, one of the best players in the Pac-12 last year. He is in the NBA draft process, and he will, in my opinion, should be a first-round pick, at least an early second-round pick. But apparently Mick Cronin got his NIL money because he's got a big-time group of players coming into this program. Kobe Johnson transfers over from USC. Eric Daly from Oklahoma State. He was their best player last year. Sky Clark, very intriguing guard, now on his 3rd school. We'll see how that shakes out coming over from Louisville. Tyler Bilodeau from Oregon State. William Kyle from South Dakota State. And then, of course, Dominick Harris transferring from LMU. Very excited to see what Dom can do in a UCLA uniform. And then speaking of players with Gonzaga connections, Trent Perry, who was recruited by Gonzaga in the 2024 recruiting class, initially committed to USC, flipped to UCLA after Eric Musselman, or I guess after Andy Enfield left USC and Eric Musselman came in to take over. UCLA, kind of like Kentucky, very new look team. Interested to see what that looks like. Last couple of teams, San Diego State, and Washington. San Diego State, it's a return game of a home and home series last year. Last year they played in the Kennel and Gonzaga lost. This year Gonzaga is really hoping to hand them a loss at their home, the VAS Center. No date scheduled for this game yet. Last year was very end of December. Curious if they try to play it around the same time this year. Another new look team for Brian Dutcher. They lose Lamont Butler to Kentucky, like we mentioned. Micah Parrish transfers to Ohio State. Jaden Ledee and Darion Trammell graduate. Elijah Saunders transfers to Virginia. That's 5 of their best players last year, all out the door. They get Nick Boyd from Florida Atlantic, Wayne McKinney, who was fantastic for Steve Lavin at San Diego. He stays in the same city and transfers over to the Aztecs. They also get Kimo Ferrari and Jared Coleman-Jones from Brown and Middle Tennessee State, respectively. Another team that's underwent a lot of changes, but Brian Dutcher's a great coach. I think this team's still going to be very quality next season. And then Washington. Game should be in Spokane. Last year's was at UW. The date is to be determined. This was supposed to be the last season of that home-and-home series that was agreed to, but because COVID canceled a few of the games, the reports that I've seen indicate that there's at least 2 more years of this Washington series. Washington, of course, no longer coached by Mike Hopkins. He just recently got an assistant coaching job with the Phoenix Suns. Instead, Washington will be coached by Danny Sprinkle, who last year was at Utah State. 2 years ago was at Montana State. He is a phenomenal coach. Utah State was expected to finish 9th in the Mountain West. They won the regular season last year, earned an 8th seed in the NCAA tournament. He goes to Washington. He brings his star player, Great Osobor, with him, apparently, reportedly, with a $2 million NIL deal for Great Osobor. That is a whole bunch of money. Osobor did average about 17 and 10 last year at Utah State. Very talented player, going to fit in very nicely at Washington, of course, under the coach that he played with at both Montana State and Utah State. Lots of other additions for the Huskies. DJ Davis from Butler, Makai Mason from Rice, Luis Courtwright from Rhode Island, Casey Ibekwe from Oregon State, Chris Conway, the big man from Oakland, who upset Kentucky last year in the big dance, and then Tyler Harris, who was a superstar freshman for Portland last year. I watched their opening game against Long Beach State. I was in the building. First half, I watched Tyler Harris, and I was like, that dude's not going to be at Portland next year. And I was sad that I was right, but I was right. And now he's going over to Washington. Washington loses a bunch of players. They had a ton of fifth-year seniors last year. Severe Wheeler's gone. Keon Brooks is gone. Moses Wood, another Portland to Washington transfer. He's gone. Paul Mulcahy. All those guys are gone. They also lose Corin Johnson to the portal. He goes to Louisville. Braxton Mia goes to Nebraska. Wesley Yates transfers to USC, another former Gonzaga target. Nate Calmisi to Washington State. Lots of departures, lots of incoming freshmen. They also had Zoom Diallo, who I expect to play big minutes right away in that 2024 recruiting class. Should be fun to see what this Washington team looks like next year and in the Big Ten. And then we got the battle for Atlantis. And I'm not going to go through every team in the battle for Atlantis because we don't know what those matchups are going to look like as of right now. But here are the teams officially in the Atlantis tournament. It will be November 27th through 29th in the Bahamas. Alphabetically, the teams in this tournament: Arizona, Davidson, Gonzaga, Indiana, Louisville, Oklahoma, Providence, who replaced Creighton, and then West Virginia. Well, folks, 5 games left on Gonzaga's non-conference schedule. How many are going to be bye games? How many might actually be marquee opponents? We're going to talk about what that might look like in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, FanDuel. Folks, it is NBA Finals time and Stanley Cup Finals as well. Baseball, of course, is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And folks, Gonzaga's odds to win the 2025 national championship have altered slightly. They've been at plus 1,800. They're now at plus 2,000. So you can capitalize, make a little bit of extra dough if you toss some money down right now. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, closing out the show today, talking about the rest of Gonzaga's non-conference schedule. Now that the WCC schedule is out, it's an 18-game regular season schedule. We know how many games are left on Gonzaga's schedule. For those of you who listened to the mailbag episode, we did talk about this briefly during that show. I'm just going to expand on it a little bit longer here. The last couple of years, here's how Gonzaga's non-conference schedule has shooken out based on kind of my perception of these teams. Last year, they played 5 marquee opponents, and that does not include the 3 games they played in their MTE, which was, of course, the Maui Invitational. So 5 marquee games, 3 games in a tournament, 2 mid-tier games. Last year, that was Yale and Washington, who were like between, I think the 5 marquee games were all in the top 30 at KenPom, and then the rest of their bad games were outside the top 200, and Gonzaga only played like 2 teams between 30 and 200 in the KenPom rankings outside of the MTE, and it was Yale and Washington. And then they had the 5 bye games, the Bakersfields, the Jackson States, Mississippi Valley State, etc. The year before that, exactly the same. 5 marquee non-conference opponents, 3 games as part of their MTE, 2 mid-tier games, and then 5 bye games. The problem is that Gonzaga can't quite do that this year because they have 2 less non-conference games because of the added 2 teams, Washington State and Oregon State, in the WCC. So right now, Gonzaga has 4 marquee games already on their schedule. They have one, what I'm saying is a mid-tier game with Washington. And then they have 3 games in the MTE in Atlantis. And then they have 5 games left. So it would be easy to look at the last couple of years where they've had 5 bye games and say, well, all 5 of Gonzaga's remaining games are going to be bye games. They're all going to be your Texas Southerns, your Idahos, your North Floridas, whomever you want to kind of toss in there in that conversation. I'm not super confident that that'll be the case. I'm hopeful, maybe too optimistic, that Gonzaga is going to try to get one more marquee game. They have 4 right now. The last 2 years, they've had 5. They have 1 mid-tier game. The last couple of years, they've had 2. My hope is that Gonzaga's 5 remaining games include 1 marquee opponent, 1 mid-tier opponent, by which I mean like a good mid-major school or an average to below average high major school, and then 3 bye games. With 3 bye games, you would also have an exhibition game, which I'm not including in that conversation. So you have 3 bye games, 1 exhibition game. I think that's going to be enough with the added WCC games, which no disrespect to Washington State or Oregon State. I think Washington State kind of falls in that mid-tier game. Oregon State's kind of a bye game. Frankly, they're not very good. So I think Mark Few and the Zags are going to try to use the fact that they have less non-conference games and not just fill them with bad games. Like have the less non-conference games mean less bye games, if that makes sense. So here are my predictions. 1 marquee game left, 1 mid-tier game left, 3 bye games. That's my projection for how Gonzaga's final 5 games are going to go. Let's take a look at some of the marquee options for Gonzaga. Toss some schools on there that I think Gonzaga and Mark Few have a connection with, that they've played in the past, that I think could be logical additions to Gonzaga's schedule. They're not going to play anybody who's in the battle for Atlantis, so any of those teams are ruled out right away. So with Baylor, Mark Few, Scott Drew, they've played each other a lot. I think if this doesn't end up being a non-conference games, it could be an exhibition game, which they've done in the past as well with Baylor specifically. I think that'd be a really fun game. That Baylor team looks really good going into this season. They add Jeremy Roach. They add Norchad O'Meara from Miami. Going to be a really good team there. Arkansas, John Calipari said to the media that they got they want 1 more big game on their schedule. We know that John Calipari and Mark Few are willing to work together. They've done it a lot. They did it at Memphis. They did it at Kentucky. Maybe they'll find a way to get a home-and-home series here with Arkansas. Xavier, another situation. Mark Few and Sean Miller have worked together a lot. Xavier wasn't very good last year, but they're going to be a lot better this year. They had injury issues that really plagued them last year. I like what the roster that Miller has built this offseason. I think this is going to be a good team. Bama, I doubt it, but I got to toss them on there. Mark Few and Nate Oates have played each other quite a few times. I think this Bama team is going to be outstanding this upcoming season. That'd be a really fun one, although I'd be surprised if that one came together. BYU, Gonzaga doesn't have a connection to Coach Kevin Young the way that they did with Mark Pope, having played in the same conference, but there's a history between the 2 schools. I could see Kevin Young wanting to get some big games on the schedule for his first season. This one makes sense to me. And then Florida. We haven't seen Mark Few and Todd Golden face off since Todd Golden was at San Francisco. This Florida team, this upcoming season is going to be very, very good. I'm very excited by what Florida is doing right now, and I think this would be a really fun game. There's also obviously some history between these 2 programs as well. Mid-tier games that I think make sense, I'll kind of rattle them off quickly. Ole Miss, mostly because Gonzaga has a relationship with Chris Beard. McNeese played each other last year in the NCAA tournament. Will Wade is trying to build the best non-conference schedule that he can. That one makes sense to me. Santa Barbara, we haven't really seen this connection before, but they continue to have a lot of success, at least in terms of recruiting talent down there at Santa Barbara. So that'd be a fun one. Yale, they did it last year. It worked out well for the Zags. Memphis, they've done it a lot in the past. They're a pretty good team. FAU, new head coach, John DeCoos, comes from Gonzaga initially. He was the director of basketball ops there. He also spent some time at Baylor. So it'd be kind of fun to see them get to square off, although Mark Few has been hesitant to play against coaches who he has worked with in the past. So I have my skepticism on whether that one would actually happen. And then bye game options, we kind of know what the bye game options look like. Idaho State for local ones, Montana State, local options. They've played North Dakota a handful of times. I don't think they'll play Eastern because of the Dan Munson connection. So I suspect that game's not going to happen this year. Then it's SWAC opponents, Texas Southern, Mississippi Valley State, Jackson State, etc. Maybe it'll be a California school like Bakersfield, who they played last year, Cal Baptist, Cal Poly, somebody like that. Tarleton State, they've played them in the past. They have a connection now with Emmanuel and Achente. That kind of makes me think they won't play that game, but it's the kind of opponent that we've seen them play in the past. There's others, Stephen F. Austin, etc., New Mexico State, going on and on and on. Plenty of options. North Florida, they've played in the past. So we'll see what the rest of the schedule looks like. I'm optimistic that we can prepare for at least one more big or at least one more mid-tier type of game for Gonzaga on their non-conference schedule. But I wouldn't be surprised if at least 3, maybe even 4 of the final 5 games are opponents that don't really excite anybody in the Gonzaga fan base. But hopefully we get at least one more pretty good opponent for Gonzaga to square off with next year. It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to the everyday listeners. Shout out to those of you hanging out with us on the Discord channel as well. Be back on Wednesday talking more season in review stuff. We're going to talk about the Olympics coming up and what that means for Gonzaga. We're going to have some guests later in the week talking about recruiting, talking about the WCC, all sorts of good stuff coming your way this month here on Locked On Zags. So stick with us. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.